welcome to Sober Dad Crew, the podcast where we talk about all things dad, sobriety, recovery, parenting, music, tattoos, and more. For more information or to get in touch, visit soberdadcrew.com. My guest this episode is Sean Daniels, theater director and writer of the autobiographical play The White Chip, which tells the story of an alcoholic whose life is spinning out of control just as his professional dreams are about to be realized. The White Chip is currently playing off Broadway. Sean, welcome to Sober Dad Crew. So how many kids do you have?
Just one.
I have four.
Oh my God.
Well, I got remarried in June. So I have the younger two are 7 and turning 12 next week. So those are technically my stepkids, though I don't think of them that way. And then
yeah, of course,
a 16-year-old and a 20-year-old. So I've run the gamut, and I'm doing it again.
You know everything I'm about to experience. I don't even know what I don't know.
Did you have like a magical Christmas?
We had, my wife's family. Yeah. I mean, at 5 is like full rundown, scream at what Santa brought you, that type of Christmas.
Yeah. We had some of that at 7 still.
Yeah. Yeah. When does that go away?
It depends. I feel like he's going to be a believer for a long time. So he was up at 1:30 in the morning with my wife.
Really? When did the rest
go?
Did at school tell them what happened?
We finally, I think, got up at 6, but I had been sick. I got some stomach bugs. So I rolled out at 6, just not feeling good. Yeah, it was a weird Christmas for us because the older two were at their mom's and they both had COVID. So we're actually tomorrow doing round 2 Christmas. So it's been a weird holiday this year because that was the first time I wasn't with the older two ever at Christmas. So that was kind of weird because they were isolating at their mom's house. So
right.
Yeah, I think 7 or 8. He seems really in it and a magical thinker, and he doesn't seem poised to end. We do Elf on the Shelf too. Just a curse against God and man, but we do it. 24 days of turning up the gas.
Right.
Christmas is coming. Let's do a 24-day countdown. That's a great idea. Whoever came up with that as a thing. Did you always want to be a dad?
I was on the fence. I could have really done it or not had kids. I feel like I could have been one way or another. And then when I met my wife, she was always going to have kids. She was. And so it was to date her, you knew you were in for it. If you were, we had to talk pretty early, if it's going to happen for us, I'm going to have kids. So I think if you decide that you're going to keep dating me, then that's going to be in your future. And oddly, we had, silver lining. We had a pregnancy scare early on. She calls and says, "You're late." She's late. And you suddenly have realized things could be different. And honestly, for the first time ever, I wasn't panicked about it. I was like, okay, all right, if that's what it is, then okay, we'll do this. So, it was actually helpful for all my life. I had anytime anybody had been a day late, panicked, freaked out, what does this mean? What are we going to do? And for the first time ever, I was like, okay, all right, yeah, this is okay. And then it turned out to not be anything, but it was kind of a bit of a gut check in terms of I was finally ready to be a dad. And so, I mean, as you know, listen, no one should be a parent that doesn't want to do it because it is the most all-encompassing, exhausting, worst, most expensive, most exhilarating thing you've ever done. All the cliches are true.
And sometimes all at the same time.
Yeah, very much so at the same time. When you're like, this is the best time ever. And
coming at you. It's
right.
The Millennium Falcon going into hyperdrive. It's just and your career in theater
through your wallet onto the other side.
Yeah,
that's essentially what it is.
Yeah, your wallet's on fire. But your career in theater too, I imagine, it's not a 9 to 5 kind of gig. So I would imagine that also is harder as a parent.
My My daughter is a terrible sleeper, and she's still a terrible sleeper at 5. And we think that's because we've forced her to be raised in the performing arts in America, which means that we're sometimes in different towns. I went to London to direct a show. She came with us, and it was great, but that screwed with her, sleep schedule. And maybe the thing that like eventually unpack, but we don't know yet. So she was 2 to 3.5 during her COVID year. So she is so like attached to us because I feel like for that year that normally she would have been socializing and she would have
Right.
been getting to know other kids, like she only saw 2 adults for her entire year and a half. And so I feel like her bond with us is incredibly deep. And sometimes she has late nights, sometimes we're in different towns. A life in the performing arts is definitely she's incredibly verbal, talks all the time. And I feel like that's because she spent a lot of time with like wonderfully strange theater people backstage. She loves to go to the theater. She loves to get up on stage beforehand, play with the props. So it's she kind of doesn't realize what a magical life that she lives.
Yeah, I thought you were just
But
gonna
we kind
say
of
she had
suffer
a
for it
job.
sometimes because often.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know. Well, she
right. She's
she
like
pretends she
waiting
has a job.
tables.
Well, when we go to the theater, she pretends that she's a member of stage management, and she wants to sweep, she wants to help set things up, she wants to be helpful. I think because she's an only child and because she's in the theater, like she spends a lot of time with colorful adults.
Right.
And so that's just who, that's what she thinks the world is.
Yeah, and we have sort of a mutual theater connection. I served on the board of the Hangar Theater in Ithaca for a number of years, and through the COVID years, which was really a hard time for all performing
Yeah.
arts. And like America sucks in general for the performing arts. COVID even made that worse. Fewer people are going to the theater now.
I think it's interesting. I have, friends that run supermarkets and they always say like you never close down a supermarket for renovation because people then just go to a different supermarket,
Right.
right? You always, even if it takes 3 times as long, you keep part of the supermarket open and you work in other parts. And I think the performing arts was so hit in multiple ways, but that's because people didn't go to the theater for a year, at least a lot of people fell out of the habit, or a lot of people, and there are plenty of theaters. I work now at Florida Studio Theater, and we just announced a second extension of a show that I directed. And so there are, shows do connect with people, but I think like all of us, we got a reset. And I think if you weren't that tied to your theater, if you didn't have a level of commitment, you didn't really like you were valued there or that the work was for you or spoke to your community, it was an easy time to back out. And I think that's probably true of everything. So I definitely think coming back has changed buyers' habits and changed, they're really valuing true relationships that they have with performing arts organizations.
Yeah. And that's good to value those relationships, but with an already aging donor base and all those things and subscription sales sort of going down and just so many options out there, it is a challenge.
Yeah, I think everybody in the pandemic got like really great flat screen TVs and sound bars and wonderful couches and so you really have to. I think the challenge for us as theater makers is you have to create something that they can't get at home. You have to
Yeah.
create something that is a theatrical event that if it's boring, they're not gonna come. They're not gonna show up because they could watch something at home while they scroll on their phone. So I think that this has always been the task for us, but now it's even more so. Like there has to be things about our art form that nobody else can do that you have to come and be with other people. And sometimes that's musical, sometimes that's laughter. But I think that's the task force in the future is anything remotely boring or anything that could have been a TV show probably should be a TV show. You should watch at home. And we have to figure out what our art form does best that nobody else is doing.
Can you talk a little bit about your recovery journey?
I was always a big drinker, and I think the performing arts really kind of adds that into the mix. You kind of feel like that's part of what it takes for to be an artist. The idea that, all the great writers. I mean, there's some amazing stat like 95% of all Pulitzer Prize winning, authors are loaded drunks, right? Like Tennessee Williams, like we couldn't love that the man drank all the time more. He put a shotgun in his mouth and ended his life, but
Right.
but we all feel like that's all part of the process of being an artist. Is that sometimes being self-destructive is part of the bargain that you make with the devil to be able to have the gift that you have. And so I'd always been a really big drinker. And as happens, you have a series of events. My dad had Parkinson's and then he passed away. And, drinking goes from being the fun, if I look back, it's almost a direct line from going out 3 nights a week to going out 6 nights a week to going out every night to going out at 5 o'clock to going out for lunch, um, until eventually I was a drinker, and so in October of 2011, tried to take my own life because I had, it had been so long since somebody had smiled to see me coming. And I had been fired from my job and I'd crashed my car, and my wife at the time was leaving me. And it just felt like everybody would be so much happier to not have me around. And I've never really gotten along with my mother, but on that night, I called her for whatever it is you believe in. The day I called her was the 1 year anniversary of her getting sober. She was on her way home from her meeting where she was getting her 1 year chip for making it through a year. And I called and she got me through that evening and got me into a rehab center in Jacksonville, Florida. And there I was really blessed to find a group of men that preached science, that talked about the science of addiction, that talked about dopamine and neural pathways and genetics and brain chemistry and all these things that I had never heard of before in terms of, I'd been to a bunch of AA meetings. I've been to a bunch of, in the state of Kentucky, court-ordered AA meetings because I had had an aggravated DUI. And so I was required to attend AA and get somebody to sign my piece of paper. And I'd never heard anything about science or about that, 40 to 60% of what means somebody will become addicted or not is genetics, right? And that brain chemistry and that neural pathways change over time, and that, euphoric recall is where your brain actually does things out of your control so that you can remember the great parts of a dopamine high. I mean, all these things I'd never heard of before. I just kind of heard like, stop lying to yourself and pull it together and find Jesus. And I really couldn't do that. For me, the finding religion aspect was a real sticking point. Also because I wanted there to be sticking points. I didn't want to get sober. So I
Right.
was always looking for like what possibly what holes could I poke in any of this so I could go out and get loaded. I've been very lucky. I have a play that I wrote that's about to have an off-Broadway production, a second off-Broadway production that is essentially me sharing my story. And part of why I felt the need to write something, get it out there, was I really, for all the, even now, even 12 years into it, we don't hear about the science of addiction. We don't hear about these things. I mean, it has been declared a disease since the late 50s. And at the end of the day, everybody knows that it's a disease, but then also sort of kind of can't you just pull it together for this Thanksgiving and not show up and cause trouble. Like we
Right.
all at the end of the day still feel like it's probably a moral failing, and or something that because the initial act was a choice, it feels like it continues to be a choice. And so that part of my mission is to try to share that experience, strength, and hope with the rest of the world. And, when it comes to being a parent, I am really lucky that I met my wife after I got sober. I was only a little bit sober. You're not supposed to date in your first year, and I did not follow that rule at all. But
Which
I,
was good in
met
this
her.
case.
which was great in this case. I
Good
understand
job
why.
breaking the rules.
That's right. That's right. But my wife or my daughter have never seen me drunk. And so that is, that's such a gift that of all the amends I have to make, and I'm continually making them, that doesn't have to be something that they're scarred with.
I mean, my wife and I, we're both sober and, have a sober house. And that became such a piece early on. I mean, we met in COVID in our own funny way. So that's its own interesting time to meet somebody and date in a pandemic, and the thought and intentionality and safety that goes into, thinking about a first kiss, right? In a pandemic is like a different thing, but it came out very quickly in one of our video chats, because we did all these video chats before going for a walk. It was like olden days,
Yeah, wait.
without
So
the
how did
chaperone.
so how did you even meet her though?
We met on Bumble. So
Okay.
Bumble could sponsor my podcast if they wished.
Yeah. Yeah, there
Success
you go.
story. So actually, I think it was really valuable for us to just have, we both had kids. We had to work around, figure all that out. We took all these walks. We just go, I live in the Finger Lakes in New York. We go sit by the lake, drink coffee, and just talk. So this really like deep getting to know each other thing that happened.
That's so cool. And you said your wife is sober also, or it's just a
Mm-hmm.
sober home?
She's sober also. So we had a sober wedding, kind of the whole deal.
What? Well, now I'm fascinated by that because I don't, my wife is not sober, but she also, if she ever has two drinks, will throw up. She just can't hold her lip. So she's like accidentally sober. She can have like a
Right.
glass of champagne and it's fun. And then every time that she's like, oh, I'll have a second one, always disaster, So
Yeah.
it's just like she's never going to become the real accomplished drunk that I was.
Right. Her body is
Um,
not going to allow it.
it's not going to allow it. But I'm fascinated by sober couples because for the first, I'm going to say like 5 years of our relationship, we didn't keep any booze in the house. It was just part of not. And then now we've sort of moved into like champagne and wine for like when we have dinner parties coming over,
Mm-hmm.
but we still don't ever keep any vodka because that was my drink of choice. And the last thing I need is a handy bottle, somewhere. But I'm fascinated by sober couples who just, So what? So did you tell people at your wedding it's going to be a sober wedding? There's not going to be any booze.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a really small wedding, so everybody sort of knew.
Yeah.
And I think maybe there are a couple of people who were a little grumbly about that, but whatever. It's not their
Yeah.
wedding. It's mine.
Yeah.
So, I think we had 40 people. So it was small. It was all our people. It was like all our friends and family. It wasn't anyone who didn't know our story, So
Yeah. Yeah.
but that was just such a foundational piece for us in meeting and getting to know one another. And I think we both had something about it on our profile, so it was not a big deal. I mean, we go out, we go to shows, like it doesn't bother us to be around it. There's not temptation. We
Right.
have friends that drink. It's really, I DJ on occasion, and the place I do it, they're slinging beers. It's just, it's nice to be able to sort of go out and do that. I get that not everybody's able to do that, right? That's not everybody's capacity.
Right.
So it's nice when there are like sober spaces. So do they sell wine and beer for your play?
You know what is amazing? They did a version, one of the most profound nights of my life, and kind of why I got into the recovery project. They did a reading of my play. They did several series of readings of them in Scotland because the Scottish government was thinking about doing a tour of it, and so they kind of try out the plays to be able to see how it is. And they sold beer and wine at the reading. People came knowing full well what it was and walked in, brought their beer into the space, and didn't seem to be fazed by it at all. But there was a mother who had come to the reading because she had lost her son and she didn't understand why. And there was a guy who brought his family with him because he wanted his family to better understand him. And it was so it was like, oh my God, for all, when you're 22 and doing theater, you think the most punk rock thing you can do is to put on plays and that we're going to save the world by doing plays. And this is the most, we're as hardcore as it gets. And then along the way, you really lose that. At some point you're trying to talk to a upset subscriber who doesn't have the same seats they had last year, and you realize like, wow, this is the least punk rock thing I could be doing. I'm,
Right. This is the
helping,
business.
older audiences to feel more comfortable. I'm just in a business of what it is. And for that moment, I was reminded of that punk rock feeling of like, oh no, this is the most dangerous thing we could be doing is like getting all together in a room and telling this story. And I've never, me attending a reading in Scotland means that I've never met a single person in this room before. And
Right.
we've all come together and they're there. And there's these actors that I just met and a director that I just met. And none of the jokes about pop culture in America worked at all. But the rest of the play went great. And you're like, oh, this is the beauty of gathering. And this is the beauty of anything live. And the beauty of any recovery story is that it's all the same. We all have the same story, and people that look like you and don't look like you get up and tell a similar story, and you realize just kind of how connected we are to each other. And while that was all going, a third of the audience was drinking a beer and watching the show and crying, laughing, and because they'd been dragged by a spouse or whatever, and you just don't go to the theater in Scotland without having a drink. And so, it was. It was a good reminder that when we do the show is for people to be able to see themselves on stage, but it's also for just the rest of the world to better understand who we are and what we go through, and to do it in a funny way, and to let people have a little bit of window into it. We all grew up, or I don't know how old you are, but I'm guessing we're of a similar age. And so we all grew up in the like after school special, Just Say No.
Yeah.
This is your brain on drugs, things. And so nothing in any of those is about empathy and is about storytelling and is about understanding the similarities. And really, when you talk about like dopamine highs, how close any of us are to being one thing or another in terms of just genetically how it comes together. So these opportunities have really been amazing. And so I'm glad that people come, and if they need to have a beer to watch a show, then like they should have a beer to watch a show, because I want it to be for everybody. And I would hate to ever feel so self-important about it that it stops somebody from coming. Also, maybe that person who's having a beer doesn't fully realize that they have an issue. Maybe they don't have an issue, but we hope we're open to everybody.
Yeah. Is it funny to see an actor sort of playing out your story? Like, I've never had an actor play out my story, so I don't know what that would be like.
Well, the first thing you do is that you always get somebody younger and more attractive than you to play you, right? That's step one. So that when you look back at your life, you're like, God, I look great.
That was hot.
And I know, my God, no wonder I got away with so much. And then it's it's also it's weird. I do feel like I'm having a slight nervous breakdown every time that I watch the whole show, because I go there. I remember what it felt like to be like, I just need to end it all. I had this really distinct but crazy feeling. The moment I decided to end my life was I looked at a calendar, and October has 31 days in it. And it was the 11th. And I was like, oh my God, that's so many days. There's no way I make it alive through this. That's so many. I mean, so I remember so distinctly that feeling every time that they get in the show until that moment. And so it is, it is odd to be able to watch somebody go through that and have to process it, but it keeps me humble, and it keeps me centered in the first days, like after a funeral and someone dies, like everybody has amazing perspective on the world. Everybody totally understands what is important, what is the value. And you, as always, like the world happens and shit happens and that fades. And next thing you know, you're like, grocery shopping and upset about somebody, who doesn't return their cart because you feel like that's an injustice in the world and you've lost perspective. And so every time I watch the show, I do have like real perspective on how lucky I am to have made it through it, and how it is really only like the slightest of different choices in a couple places, or my mom not answering, or not finding the right rehab center, or not having insurance that was going to cover me for
Yeah.
28 days to be able to go, and not having a home after I got out of rehab to be able to go to. I mean, there's so many things that I'm privileged to be able to have that you remove any one of them. And maybe I've been dead for 12 years, and I don't say that facetiously because it's so quickly that it could have been something else.
Yeah, I think there's so many times in life you realize like there's just a thread, right? A lot of time you're kind of this thread that holds it all together. And all those like little things, one little turn here, one little different decision. I mean, life is really it's precious, and I think like as a dad, I always try and instill that on my kids, not without being like morbid, but just life is precious and life is a gift. And like as hard as like that, the list we talked about at the beginning of parenthood is beautiful and hard and all those things. Like being called dad it's a gift. It's 100% a gift and a privilege to have a kid look at you and say dad.
Right. Yeah. No, it's and I think so much about if 40 to 60% of what makes you an addict is genetics, right? And so that it makes me feel better, right? It takes me a little off the hook. Like I come from like a solid Scottish family, and Scottish and Irish, right? So like of course, like my mother, my grandfather, everybody on the line. But then I think about like what is my responsibility to my kids because I have most likely passed that gene on to them, and so what conversations should we be having? So when somebody says dad, right, and looks up at you like that, and you feel like, oh my God, it's my job to protect you from the world, or to know that the world is a terrible place to be, but you're good. I'm going to try to tell you all the tools to not make the same mistakes I've made. And I know that you probably have the same monster in you that I have in me. Like that's why I'm fascinated by sober parents. Like, how do you prepare your kids? How do because if you're too strict and you just say like nobody can drink, oh my God, they're gonna drink more than you ever could imagine, so you
100%. That
can't.
is the natural like kid response.
Oh yeah, I mean we grew up and we weren't allowed to drink in my house, so like first chance I got in a field with friends, it was everything that I, sticking it to my parents. So how do I? But I'm terrified. I'm really terrified of like how to let her make her own decisions and mistakes. And, at some point she's going to have to like throw up in a bathroom and pass out on a college floor and all these things that, I feel like you have to do to learn what your real limits are. And I, I'm, I would ask you.
I think a couple of things. I think one thing, it was like part of this whole conversation that made me a little late, is about as parents, it's a number of things. One, I have a tremendously good relationship with my ex-wife.
Yeah.
Right. Like she and her new partner and their 4-year-old were at our wedding. Like
Right.
that's she drinks, that's a house with a glass of wine with dinner, kind of healthy modeling of, you know,
Right.
of alcohol consumption in this culture. I know people would make an argument to say there's no amount is healthy. I think, I'm not going to get into moral judgment on all that kind of stuff. So
Right.
they've seen sort of two sides of that, because I'm approaching 14 years of sobriety. So the oldest,
Congratulations.
he'll be 21. So, most of his life he hasn't seen me drink. He was young, and his sister was what, 2 when I
Yeah.
stopped. And then, my stepkids only know me this way. But we also talk about, and I think this is beyond just how do you instill, things around alcohol. It could be, teaching kids about sex. It could be any number of things. And what my wife Alexis and I talk about is we talk about putting up guardrails, right? To me, the job of a parent is not to necessarily keep my kids from swerving on the road, metaphorically speaking, but the guardrails are there to keep them from flying off the road, right? Like, they might go down the road,
Right.
hit some potholes. They're fucking gonna. I mean, that's just right? That's life. Everyone's gonna hit
Right.
potholes. I remember saying to the older two at one point, nobody ever promised you like a straight, flat, newly paved road. It's just not a thing
Right.
in life. And kids that actually don't have some bumps and all that stuff don't learn resiliency. So we really talk about just, you got to give kids freedom to do things, and with that, there's responsibility, right? If you want to have
Yeah.
more privilege, if you're almost 12 and you're looking at your 16-year-old sister who's got a job and doing all this stuff and has a lot of freedom, there's a reason she's got that freedom, and it's because she's truthful and she does all these other things. So, that's sort of the kid side of the guardrail. Is within that framework, you also have responsibilities.
So so when will you let your kids drink at an age before 21? Will you let them, how do you not make it so sexy, right? How do you not forbid it? How
I know the oldest one has, because he was also in like Costa Rica, so where the drinking age is different.
right.
I don't think you can prevent it. I mean, I remember this long ago, one of my teachers in high school, and I babysat for them, and they were vegetarian, and they're like, our kids are totally going to try burgers someday. We can't really like stop them from trying a burger. Alcohol and marijuana, other things are really pervasive. I remember with the oldest one at one point sitting down and saying to him, like, you need to understand what meth is, right? Like, when you actually need to know what these drugs are, because you're hearing
Hmm.
them tossed around. You need information. I mean, we are a very open household about, you got questions about sex, you ask them, any of that stuff. Like, kids need honest, accurate information. So I think that's part of it, is just providing information. You're not going to stop them from drinking, but I think, and I've said this to all the kids, if you're in a bad situation and you need help, you call me, no questions asked. I will come and get you out of that situation. And I think that's the piece of the parenting and the relationship. It's not right. It's not power parenting. You're not trying to parent with authority. I think you're trying to parent with compassion
Right.
and understanding and information. If you're just like, do what I say because I'm the parent, it kind of makes you a dick. It doesn't make you a good parent. And when you have a teenager, if you've done that, for the first 11 years of their life, when they're 15, they're not going to talk to you.
Right.
Because they're going to be like, I can't share with this guy. He's just going to be
Right.
pissy and tell me what to do, as opposed to creating understanding and thoughtfulness and connection. I mean, that to me is, this sort of, if there's a secret sauce to parenting, it's probably that, and patience.
Well, if it's patience, then I'm screwed. But I think you're right that we always say it's about education, right? That it's about people should know really what it is. I bought fentanyl strips for all my friends that have kids in college because I was like,
Stocking
the day
stuffers.
Yeah, I know, because the days of just what we did, where you just went to a party and someone put a pill in your mouth and you said like, "All right, how long is this one going to last?" Like those days are over, you know. And
Right.
so,
Because you will
so in many
die.
ways, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And so, um, so I'm buying them fentanyl strips because it's like, listen, just you're going to live your life. It's easier when it's other people's kids, you know. I'm like, you can live your life, but just be educated. Like, please, but before you just take 5 minutes and do this, and if there's not fentanyl in it, then you know, Godspeed in terms of where
Yeah.
it is. But you have to know beforehand. And so I guess to be the same with my daughter, it's just terrifying to think of it as her. But it's like it's got to be education, right? It's got to be you know everything, you understand your family's genetics, you understand, you know, what it could be. And you know, for yeah, that she has those, I guess, guardrails. You're right in
Right.
terms of just understanding what it is, which doesn't
And
mean that she's still not gonna have hungover days and, you know, all the things that I did for decades. It just terrifies me because I know how real it is for me and how much it almost got me.
I mean, and the guardrails shift, right? Like the guardrails of the 5-year-old are different than the guardrails of the 16-year-old. You
Right.
know, as is like the width of the road, it's sort of like a somewhat of a tired metaphor, but you know, as your kids get older too, like my oldest, we lost a friend of his to suicide, you know, when he was 15, which was probably one of the hardest conversations I've ever had is telling my son that this happened, you know, and so it's a reason why you have to have open communication with your kids to be able to have these hard conversations, but they also start to see the world differently as they get older. You know, the eyes of a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old are really pretty magical. You know,
Yeah.
I feel like my oldest is sort of this generation that's grown up with the school shootings and
Hmm.
so many conversations with him about that and still having these conversations. And he's this guy that he cares so much and wants to change the world and wants to understand. I just remember after one of them saying to him, I said, "You're never going to understand this." They said, the only thing to understand
Yeah.
is it's like unbearably sad and never should have happened. But you're never going to understand why someone did that. There's a political side of that, which is addressing issues of firearm accountability and mental health access in our country, but
Right.
you're never going to understand, and you might make yourself completely bananas trying to understand the why of some of those things.
My daughter is in kindergarten. So they did on day two what to do if a bad man comes to the school, you know. So she doesn't even know what she's doing,
Right.
but she knows that if a bad man comes, they turn off the lights, they all get down in the corner, they don't make any noise, they don't say anything until, you know, I mean, it's essentially she comes home and tells us about it, and we know it's active shooter training. And she
Yeah.
just thinks it's, you know, part of what
Right.
kindergarten is.
It's
And
the day.
so
Yeah. It's what you do at
that's
school.
terrifying.
And it,
Yeah, you have to prepare because she knows about, you know, villains. She watches TV. She
yeah.
understands bad guys, you know, so she just thinks it's that.
And that's that stuff as a parent too. Like all the shit that's out of your control. There's like a lot that you just
Yeah.
don't have control over. You know, that stuff's one. You put a lot of
Well,
faith,
and you
like
know,
in the schools.
if well, and if sobriety is about acknowledging what is in your control and what is out of your control and trying to come to terms with what, you know, the wisdom to know the difference, then, you know, them just being out in the world, school shootings, fentanyl, none of this in your control. And there's nothing that you could do besides move to a different country that to really try to make it easier for them, you know? And so it's, yeah, you're right. You're just trying to educate them best. So when these moments happen, if they happen, they know what to do.
Yeah, I want to touch back on something else that we talked about a little earlier, and it's that the notion of sort of darkness feeding creativity. Or I remember hearing an interview with Jeff Tweedy from the band Wilco, and he was
Yeah.
talking about that notion of great art comes out of pain and darkness, and he said something that sort of always stuck with me, and he said, and a sober dad, he is as well. He talked about how actually his songs were like the best part of him cutting through and
Hmm.
finding their way like to the light. And I always thought that was like really beautiful, because as your point was, we do have this sort of romanticized notion of the just like drunk or womanizing. There's like a lot of like bad sort of tropes that go with that notion of, creative person, that maybe like, as we're seeing, side note, in the Me Too world, are used to sort of excuse behaviors. But I just don't buy necessarily that being an addict and suffering makes for great art.
Well, you know what? You, at least for me, you tell yourself that it's what makes you great and that there's no cost to the work. And then when you get sober, you look back and you realize like, oh my God, the cost was great and the work was not improving. In fact,
Right.
it was getting in the way. And maybe at the beginning it made you fun and it made you loose and maybe you pulled it off. But you probably pulled it off by having twice as much charm and talent to get over the booze. And then really at some point it was detrimental. At some point the work was not as good in terms of pulling it off. And it was just a great excuse for you to continue your self-destructive bargain with it coming together. And so I as an artist, and maybe this is everybody, but I was terrified of getting sober because I thought thing that had made me successful up until that point is now gone. What if I'm boring? What if I'm not interesting anymore? What if I'm not sexy? Because all those things had been built into my mind about what it was. And I even had a person I was dating at the time, I said like, oh my God, what if I'm boring? And she said, do you have any idea how boring you are now? That, like you go every day at 5 o'clock and you sit at the bar and you talk big, but you go home and pass out at the end of the night. I mean, you don't do anything.
Right. Yeah, you're not
And
actually writing the play that's going to get off Broadway.
no, not at all. And actually, the amount of success I've had since then is it's ridiculous compared to what it was before when I was in there. And so there's a playwright, Terrence McNally, who's really one of the greatest playwrights of our time. And he got sober, and then the first play he wrote after he got sober is just had a Broadway revival, considered one of the great plays of our time, Frankie and Johnny and the Clear Loon. And so it's like it's an example of like, oh, look at other people who were fantastic artists, got sober, and then did the best work of their life because it wasn't in the way anymore. It wasn't there. But it's really baked into the romanticism of what it is, and you're young and you're drinking till 6 in the morning, and then you could still make it to rehearsal by 10 and you're brilliant and you're right, and you treat people poorly, but they suck it up because that's what art is, and none of that is true. And I feel like there's so many reckonings happening in our field and probably just across all fields where like that the things that need to be called bullshit on are getting called bullshit on. And I think for us that are addicts and alcoholics, we have to call that on ourselves, that really we're perpetuating this. We love Jack Kerouac and we love Hunter S. Thompson, and oh my God, it's all part of it. And you have to realize like, yeah, we all love Jack Kerouac, died incredibly young, and so much work was not created
Right.
because he was gone. I mean, the there's so much work that we didn't get out of these great artists because it took them before their time, and we kind of oh, Jimi Hendrix and all these people, it's like part of who they were, and it was like, well, just think about how much music we didn't get because of losing him when we did, or Mama Cass, or any of these people that we all say like, oh, they're in the club, they died young. And it's like, well, that also means that we were all robbed of decades worth of their fantastic work.
right. Because if you look at like a Sonny Rollins or a John Coltrane, like the most mind blowing stuff came after they got off heroin. Like
That's
that's
right.
when like
That's the great Coltrane album, right? Is like he gets sober and then he does it, right?
yeah, like a
Yeah,
Love Supreme is like
that's right.
so deep and profound, but that was getting clean, right? That was not about he couldn't have done it. He couldn't have, I think, dug to those depths because he was numb to it. But that was sort of part of that scene too. It was like really viewed as part of that scene and that culture of the jazz world at that time. I think so. Ithaca has a great group too that does theater with post incarcerated people and people in recovery. So I think there's also cool ways out there that theater is being used in recovery. Are you involved in anything like that?
So I'm part of a project slightly different at Florida Studio Theater, which is called the Recovery Project, which is about trying to use arts to battle addiction in the country. And so less about using theater as kind of drama therapy for the people involved, because there are fantastic organizations that already do that. There's a group called Second Act in Boston that is kind of the best at doing that, and more talking about national narratives and more talking about like how do we break down the stigma of addiction. During the pandemic, there was these great studies that happened on how do national narratives change, like really how do we think differently about something. And they studied gay marriage, right? And so Barack Obama, when he ran for president, was against gay marriage. And so you can't say what he said and run for city council as a Democrat, even here in Florida, you know. And so we have and let's be honest, was Barack Obama really against gay marriage? Probably not. He's probably
No.
being told by his people, you need to keep the coalition of people together. The popular overall opinion is this, and so we gotta suck it up and say it. And so what we're talking about is that was 20 years ago. We're talking about in 20 years, we have changed nationally how we talk about things. You know, I just moved from Arizona where they legalized marijuana. And if you had asked me in the 80s, it was that at all possible, I would say never, you know. That's the state that didn't want to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, they really
Yeah. They really did.
so
They
the
were the
fact that
last
it's
state.
on they fought it for forever. And so they, you know, it's for that to be now a state that's like, well, you know, harm reduction is important, you know, is like that shows that we change how we think about. And so what I want to do is, oh, and so these studies that said, how do we change? They came back to the arts. The arts were what caused us to change. That Ellen came out and Will and Grace was on TV and Modern Family was on TV. And next thing you know, people, you know, my mother thinks she has more gay friends than she had 20 years ago. 100% not true. It is just that it is a different thing to come out in 2023 than it was to come out in, you know, 1983. I remember Magic Johnson coming out and saying he's HIV positive, and everybody assumed he's dead because we just didn't
Right.
understand even what it was. And so the idea that like, nope, actually, he's still. I saw an article about him today, living a full life, doing
Right.
fantastic, in better shape than I am, you know. And so the idea is like we can change national narratives. We have the power, especially in the performing arts, especially in TV, especially in film and books and opera, to be able to change what it is that people think about. And that I think is just the stigma of addiction. You know, I tell people all the time, like, I don't remember this, but it feels like in the last 3 years, we have solved the scourge of peanuts. Like, if you have a peanut
I
allergy
was
and you
just
tell
thinking
somebody,
about that.
we will pull every peanut off a plane. We will go to a conference and they'll pull every peanut out of that conference because, you know, people are like, well, I could die if I come in contact with a peanut. And everybody's like, we got you. Don't worry. And I think the
Right.
difference is we know that having a peanut allergy is not a moral failing. We know that it's not your fault that you have it and we don't want you to die. So we're going to do everything we can. But when it comes to addiction, you know, no, it's not your fault, but like, just come on, just don't, so the rest of us can have fun. It's like we believe it to be a moral failing, and so we are very wishy-washy about our attempts. And it's so like that shows me like we're not really going to do anything until we change the national narrative about what it is to be addicted. We're not really going to push through any great legislation about how it is until, politicians essentially just do what it is that the vast majority of their constituents want. So we have to start at the beginning and just say, like, this is how we get rid of shame. This is how we talk about it. This is how you should be able to um, if you have diabetes, uh, man, they're there for you. If you have cancer, people are there for you. You know exactly what to do. The support system is huge. It's terrifying, and people that have been there before come out, and your boss is gonna work with you on a return to work plan, and your insurance is gonna help you to know what the next steps are, and you can get a second opinion. And actually, what's funny is all those things are actually true for people that struggle with substance use conditions. The difference is you probably just don't come forward because you're nervous about being treated differently. Your insurance actually does cover you to go to rehab. Your boss actually is not allowed to discriminate against you for being in recovery. But chances are you probably don't give anybody a chance because if you're like me, keep it to yourself. Try to solve it on your own. Try to really make sure nobody knows that you have this horrible bad thing that you do, and just try to like fake your way through what it is. The next thing you know, you're like me, you've been fired from your job. So I think that's the thing that we're working on with the arts, is to try to figure out how do we shift narratives.
And it's one of the reasons I'm pretty public about it, at work and other places, because I also think that helps shift the narrative. When somebody sees me and is like, oh, you're like the marketing guy for an architecture firm with 3 offices in New York State. Like, oh, okay. That's really
Right.
different than what I'm the media is showing me or what I'm seeing when I'm driving around the city. People have real stereotypes, I think, about what addiction looks like. I also think we live, in a capitalist system that a lot of the mechanisms around incarceration benefited from, people being on drugs and getting arrested for drug use and being in the jail. There's a lot of complexities. So when, you're trying to shift that narrative at that end, then that conversation can take in, things that maybe are a little more controversial, like addressing mass incarceration, which is a harder maybe conversation to have with some folks. People being on drugs and getting arrested for drug use and being in the jail. There's a lot of complexities. So when, you're trying to shift that narrative at that end, then that conversation can take in, things that maybe are a little more controversial, like addressing mass incarceration, which is a harder maybe conversation to have.
There are many things we have to tackle, but like you gotta have a home and not be in prison.
Right.
Those are your then for steps to be able to figure out like how to put you on a right step.
Yeah, no, that's pretty cool. And and an interesting sort of take on using the arts for broader social change.
Yeah, I just there was this great play in the 80s called The Normal Heart, and it Reagan wouldn't talk about AIDS, and they did this play at the Public Theater in New York, and Larry Kramer, the playwright, stood out front at the end of every performance and handed out flyers to people, and it created a buzz. And people are alive today because of that play. It forced Reagan to talk about what was happening, that it wasn't a gay cancer. And so we have seen before the ability of the performing arts to change narratives, to save lives. And um, more people will die from addiction in 2023 than died of AIDS at the height of the AIDS crisis. And we still don't talk about it. We sort of talk about it. We don't,
And we
um,
have the solutions in place,
yeah, yeah,
right?
we do.
We don't have to come up with some new medicine. There are medicines, there are programs. I serve on the board of the Alcohol and Drug Council of Tompkins County, and we have a detox and stabilization center. and we have other agencies that work right in there. So when you're leaving there, you're not just, thanks, see you later. No, you're like connected to the next thing, and then you're connected to the next thing, because that's where
Yep.
people fall through. Like to your point of, you need a place to live. You don't have a place
Yeah.
to live, you're back on the street. So
Right.
we make sure all those, connections are made for people. It's not a business card in somebody's hand.
Right. 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 Yeah. Well, and that's all about, I guess for me, it all comes back to stigma, right? Because it's like, well, then why don't people know? Why don't we talk about it? Why doesn't somebody say like, yep, I was there and then I was here and then here's what I did. And then, I have so many amazing, beautiful friends who beat cancer, and man, they are there for the next person. They are very public. They run races. They're in amazing shape. They're, and so they talk about it. And so if you have cancer, boom, you are in a Facebook group with them. You are with support. They tell you the places to go. They tell you, and it's like, that's beautiful. That's what I want to set up for us to, so that you can, but you have to live shame free, right? You have to be, everybody has to be as public as you and I are about it, so that we can start those type of places, so that when you're struggling, it's not like, I think I heard that such and such is sober, maybe reach out. Like, it should be as public as cancer. It should be like, you are in a group, you with people supporting you.
Well, it's how the two of us got connected, right? Like we have a mutual connection, and she just said, "Oh, you guys should talk."
Right.
Right? Like we didn't know each other. We have, some theater connection, and she was like, "Oh, two sober dads. Okay, you guys should get together and talk about this, because you're willing to share with people, about your sobriety, but also, you know, dadding and the world." And I think, to your point, that's really what shows people another way. It is that sort of adage: if you can't see it, you can't be it.
Yeah. 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 Well, and that's, I feel like sometimes it's exhausting to listen to me talk about recovery all the time. And then you hear somebody say like, "Oh my God, thank you so much because I have been, struggling, and just to know that you made it through, and thank you for being so public." And you're like, "Oh, okay." That I can put up with a few more eye rolls if that's the also sometimes the response that I get from people.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing too, being public for folks who aren't sober. Like one of the people who owns the company where I work, we're at a conference and we're trying to get dinner, and the only places to sit were at the bar. And he's like, "Is this okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm cool. Like, thank you for asking. I actually appreciate you thinking and making sure that I'm cool with that. Totally cool with that. Starving. They've got mocktails. I'm like good to go." But also, getting that people
Right.
who aren't in recovery to actually think about creating, and I think about this in the workplace a lot, a culture and environment, and the theater's probably the same too, right? After parties are chock a block with alcohol. So how do you, make sure you create a world and an environment for people that's inclusive? And I see with our younger staff too, they're not necessarily sober. They're less alcohol oriented people in their 20s. It's just a different vibe.
I went to a opening night of a theater here, and free wine, for anybody attending, and down the hallway, and you're like, oh my God. Like, even in 2023, it's like, everyone's doing their best. Everyone's trying to like put together a fun evening so that you're there, and there just aren't options. You're like, it doesn't have to be, if mocktails are your thing, that's awesome. I just want some Diet Coke.
Right. Or a
I just
seltzer or
want to,
something.
yeah, just something to be able, like, that's all I want is options. And I feel like, you know, if they had champagne, my wife would have had a thing of champagne, and that would be awesome. But I feel like then I should have the option to have something at the same way. Vegetarians, there's always a vegetarian option on every menu, right? We know how to do this. We know how to make ourselves open to different groups of people. And so it's just about options. It's not even asking anybody else to do anything less. You can still have an arts event, and everybody that wants to have incredibly strong cocktails and give them to donors, like, knock yourself out. I just want to have options for people that are there, that if they don't want it, because they're in recovery or because they're pregnant or because, they just don't want to drink that night. That there
Right. Or they
are,
already had a beer and now they want something else.
oh my God, or my brother. I have a brother who is that guy who like gets a beer with dinner and then drinks half of it and then forgets that he had a beer, or I guess he's done, or I guess he just had as much as he wanted. Things I don't understand, and so like for him, it's just like, yeah, I guess I drink half a beer and then I switch to like a diet soda, or I switch to a water and I had the beer I wanted, and it's just like he didn't get the gene that I got.
Yeah.
So, and so he wants options too.
One of my big options pet peeves. So we were at one of the industries my firm works in is healthcare, and we do hospitals and stuff. We're at a hospital gala, and my wife and I go for seltzer, and they go to put it in a plastic cup. Well, everyone else has glassware. I'm like, I'm not
Right.
like 6. Like I did, and I said, I was like, can I have a glass, please, with a stem? Like I don't. Well, I
But you
don't need
don't,
a plastic cup with a straw.
that's right. But you don't have a big kid drink, right? That's the whole
Yeah,
difference.
right. So it's I don't know. That's just a funny pet peeve for me. I'm like, why are you giving me a shitty plastic cup? And it's plastic. Like you have a dishwasher here. Like why
Yeah.
are you giving me plastic in 2023 when we should really be trying not to have so much plastic?
Yeah. And also like now I cannot blend in at all. I have to and people are going to ask me about why I have a different drink, right?
Well,
Of course.
right. Which I feel like is maybe happening less. I've definitely worked in jobs where people didn't like that I didn't get drinks at events. Or would question that, which I always felt like was a little them not liking the reflection that was coming back. But I think maybe that's less. Like you just shouldn't ask people why they're not drinking. It's none of your business.
I do feel like, and not to project on them, but I do feel like part of it is they're worried you're going to judge them. They're worried that they're going to, they're about to have 11 drinks over the course of the evening, 7 drinks over like every single person I know, when they go into the doctor and the doctor says, how many drinks do you have per week, lies,
Right.
you say, oh, I have 3 drinks probably total in a week, right? Everybody lies about that, right? And so if you're there saying you're sober, then you're going to have to point out somehow that points out to them that they know
Right.
7 drinks at a gala in 3 hours is not, not a healthy amount, but they want to have fun. So, get off
Or
my
they have
back. So I feel
social
like part of it is
anxiety.
that, oh my God, who doesn't, And so they, it helps, right? It helps to make the whole evening go easier.
All right. And one more question for you. And it's just any advice to other dads out there? Is there, you know, what's one thing you do that is a good trick? I had one guy who said he comes home every night and he puts his cell phone down until after his kids are asleep. He puts it in his office.
I am not as good a dad as that man, but I will say
Nor am I.
yeah, I have a lot of other dads that I talked to, and I feel like that is part of it, that I'm in contact with other dads, even if they're not sober, but some of them are, because I always feel like it's nice to know. I have a great friend in town who's a sober dad, and so it's just always nice to know, like, my God, what I'm going through is too. Other people have gone through it. Other people have lived through it. Other people have screwed things up. Other people have, made these mistakes, and they're doing fine, and they've moved on. And if anything, I probably have more grace for my parents now going through it, because I'll tell you, like, just getting our kid alive, fed, and to school is enough. And if she has to go to therapy for the things that we've said, great, go for it. And then I realized, like, oh, well, then I should extend the same version to my parents, which is to say, like, all the things I thought they did wrong that they could have done better. They're barely holding it together, as any of us are. And
Right.
so I feel like that's the thing. I love having other dads. I love, that they're in AA meetings and with men with kids on the playground, you kind of see this world that could exist for men if there wasn't toxic masculinity and everything, which I think is to say that these are all men that have been humbled, and
Yeah.
by their parents, by their sobriety, whatever. And so you just kind of like, oh, it's beautiful to watch like men help each other in these moments. I mean, I got sober in an all men's group, and so you could just be like, oh, if it wasn't about like who's the most competitive, who's the richest, who has the biggest dick, any of these things that infiltrate every conversation about men, like the generosity and the way that we're there for each other and the way that we don't really have the tools because we were never taught that this was an acceptable way to communicate. It's all about breadwinning. You really get to see how beautiful relationships between men can be. And how once they've kind of been humbled, they really can be there for each other in very sweet ways and in ways that you realize in your own life, man, you are missing that. You really don't have you know, my wife posts something a little weird on Facebook, and like four of her friends call to make sure she's okay. And I have a lot of great friends. Not a single one of them would ever do that because it's just not the way that we're
Yeah.
programmed to
Yeah.
interact with each other. And so it's really great to see how great men can be for each other in those situations. And so, I guess my best bit of advice is like to have other dads, to have other men in your life, to have other male friends because it's hard. We're not programmed to do it. It's not really set up that way, but it's incredibly rewarding.
Awesome. That's an awesome place to end. I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has
Yeah.
been amazing to be
Yeah.
on.
Thanks for listening. For more information, for links to any music or books we talked about, or to buy some Sober Dad Crew merchandise, please visit soberdadcrew.com.